The candle in Benedict's study had burned down to a stub, and still he sat waiting. He told himself it was the estate ledgers keeping him awake, the stack of unpaid accounts from the tenant farms, the letter from his solicitor about the north pasture boundary dispute. Surely these were reason enough for a duke to sit alone past midnight in a cold study, coat discarded, cravat loosened, a glass of brandy going warm at his elbow. But the ledgers had not moved from the same page in over an hour. Blackwood Manor slept around him. Somewhere above, the household staff would be dreaming in their narrow beds, worn out from a day of scrubbing and polishing and bowing to a master who rarely thanked them. Somewhere in the stables, the horses shifted in their stalls, and somewhere out there, past the iron gates and the long gravel drive, Cecily Hartwell was not where she belonged. She had asked for the evening off 3 days ago. A simple request, delivered with her eyes fixed politely on the floor, as a housemaid's request ought to be delivered. Dinner with an old family friend, she had said. Nothing more. Benedict had granted it without a second thought. He was a duke. He did not concern himself with the comings and goings of his servants. That was what he told himself, at least until the clock struck 11, and then midnight, and then 1, and he found he could not concentrate on a single line of figures because his mind kept drifting to the servants' entrance and whether it was locked, and to the dark roads beyond his gates, and to a merchant named Julian Ward, whose name had crossed his desk once, in connection with a shipping contract, and whom he now could not stop thinking about, with an ugly, unfamiliar heat rising in his chest. It was nearly 3 in the morning when he heard the door. He was on his feet before he knew he had moved, crossing the study in long strides, his boots silent on the Turkish carpet. He reached the corridor, just as Cecily slipped through the servants' entrance, easing the heavy door shut behind her, with the practiced care of someone who did not wish to be heard. She did not see him at first. In the low light of the single-wall sconce, he watched her lean back against the door and exhale, as though she had been holding her breath the entire carriage ride home. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, or perhaps from something else entirely, and tied around her slender wrist, half hidden beneath the sleeve of her cloak, was a strip of pale blue silk, a favor, the kind a gentleman might press into a lady's hand at the end of an evening, a small token to be remembered by. 3 o'clock, Benedict said. Cecily startled so violently she nearly lost her footing. Her hand flew to her chest, and when her eyes found him standing in the shadows of the corridor, all the color that had been in her cheeks seemed to drain away at once. "Your Grace, I did not think anyone would still be awake." Evidently not. He stepped closer, close enough that the candlelight caught the silk favor on her wrist, and something in him tightened like a fist. "You said it was dinner with a family friend." It was. Dinner does not last until 3 in the morning, Miss Hartwell. She lifted her chin. It was a small gesture, barely anything at all, but it struck him harder than a shout would have. Cecily Hartwell had never once, in the 2 years she had served under his roof, looked at him with anything but careful deference. Now her eyes held something sharper. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but I was not aware my evenings after my duties were concluded were any concern of the household. Everything under this roof is my concern. My time is my own, once my work is done. That has always been the arrangement." "Has it?" Benedict's voice dropped, quiet and dangerous, in a way that made her go still. "And who was it you dined with so late into the night? Julian Ward, was it not?" Her silence was answer enough. "You will not see him again," he said. Cecily's composure cracked at last, color flooding back into her face, but this time from anger rather than embarrassment. "You cannot tell me who I may or may not see. In 4 months my indenture ends. I will be a free woman, and I will keep whatever company I choose. Benedict felt something cold settle over him, a strange and terrible calm that came before the worst decisions of his life. He had not meant to say it. He had told himself he would keep this particular truth locked away, a private arrangement between himself and his solicitor, until he had decided what to do with it. But her defiance, standing there with another man's favor tied to her wrist, pulled the words out of him before he could stop them. "Your indenture will not end in 4 months." Cecily blinked. "What are you saying?" "I purchased your family's debt from your father's creditors 8 months ago. Your contract has been altered. You are bound to this estate, Miss Hartwell, for as long as I require it." He watched the horror bloom across her face, and even as guilt twisted beneath his ribs, he did not take the words back. Indefinitely. News travels fast in a house full of servants, and by the time the sun had properly risen over Blackwood Manor, everyone from the scullery boy to the head groundskeeper knew that the Duke had been heard shouting at Cecily Hartwell in the small hours of the morning. Mrs. Gable heard it before most, as housekeepers tend to hear everything eventually. She had been woken at 3:30 by Agnes, one of the younger maids, who claimed she'd crept to the top of the servants' staircase and heard raised voices coming from the study, the Duke's voice, low and furious, and then Cecily's, thin and shaking. Agnes hadn't caught the words. She hadn't needed to. A Duke did not raise his voice at a housemaid over nothing. By 7, Mrs. Gable had formed her own conclusions, and she did not care for them one bit. She found Cecily in the servants' hall, still in yesterday's uniform, dark circles under her eyes as though she hadn't slept at all. The other maids fell quiet as Mrs. Gable approached, their eyes darting between the housekeeper and the girl who had, in the space of one night, become the subject of every whisper in the house. "You'll want to explain yourself," Mrs. Gable said, arms folded beneath her ample bosom. "There is nothing to explain, Mrs. Gable. Nothing to explain. A Duke shouting in his own study at 3 in the morning, and a maid creeping in through the servant's door with her cheeks red as apples. I've kept this household for 11 years, girl, and I know trouble when it walks past me." Cecily said nothing. What could she say? That the Duke had informed her, in a voice like iron, that she was now bound to Blackwood Manor for the rest of her working life, with no more say in the matter than a horse or a piece of furniture? That she had lain awake the remaining hours until dawn, trying to decide whether to weep or to scream, and had settled instead on a numb, disbelieving silence. None of it was fit to say aloud, not to Mrs. Gable, not to anyone. The housekeeper took her silence for guilt. "I'll not have a maid who fancies herself above her station, entertaining gentlemen callers and vexing his grace at all hours. You'll take the glass house today, every pane, every tile, top to bottom, and you'll do it without the warming pan, since it seems you've energy enough to spare for midnight outings." It was, everyone in the servants' hall understood, a punishment, dressed up as a chore. The grand glass house sat at the eastern edge of the manor grounds, a soaring structure of iron and glass that Benedict's late mother had commissioned decades ago for her collection of orange trees and rare orchids. In summer, it was warm enough to blister the skin. In the depths of autumn, with the frost already creeping in from the fields, it was a different kind of misery altogether. The marble tiles beneath the plant beds, cold enough to numb bare fingers within minutes. The glass panes fogged with condensation that turned to a thin sheet of ice by mid-morning. Cecily knelt on those tiles with a stiff brush and a pail of water that had long since gone frigid, scrubbing at frost that seemed to reform as quickly as she cleared it away. Her knees ached. Her fingers had gone from red to a worrying shade of white. And still she worked, because there was nothing else to do, because refusing would only bring worse trouble down on her head, and because some stubborn part of her refused to let Mrs. Gable, or the Duke, wherever he was, see her broken. She did not know that Benedict was watching her. He stood at the far end of the glass house, half hidden behind a row of dormant orange trees, a place he had not visited since his mother's death. He had come, he told himself, to inspect the panes for winter damage before the frost worsened. It was a poor excuse, and he knew it. He had come because he could not stay away, because the sight of Cecily's flushed, furious face in the corridor last night had haunted every hour since, and because some ungovernable instinct in him needed to see that she was still there, still under his roof, still safe. What he saw instead filled him with a shame he had not expected. She was shivering. Even from this distance he could see it, the way her shoulders trembled with each pass of the brush, the way she paused every few minutes to blow warmth into her cupped hands before returning them to the icy water. He had done this, not Mrs. Gable, not fate, not circumstance. He had spoken words in anger he could have kept locked away forever, and those words had set in motion a punishment that was, in truth, entirely his doing. He should have gone to her. Should have ordered Mrs. Gable to release her from the task, should have sent for a warming pan and dry gloves and put an end to the whole miserable business with a single command, as was well within his power as master of the house. He did not move. Some tangled combination of pride and guilt and the lingering, possessive anger he still felt at the sight of that blue silk favor kept his boots rooted to the stone floor. He told himself it would look strange, suspicious even, if the Duke suddenly intervened on behalf of one housemaid's chores. He told himself Cecily would not welcome his interference in any case, not after what he had confessed to her in the dark of the study. He told himself a great many things, standing there in the cold morning light, and none of them made him feel any less like a coward. He watched until his own hands had gone numb from the temperature, and then, without a word to anyone, he turned and left the glass house the way he had come, leaving Cecily alone on the frost-bitten marble, unaware that anyone had seen her at all. 2 days passed before the bouquet arrived, and in those 2 days, Cecily said barely a word to anyone. She moved through her duties with a kind of hollow efficiency, dusting the picture frames in the long gallery, turning down the beds in the guest wing, carrying trays up and down the back stairs with her eyes fixed straight ahead. The other maids had learned to leave her be. Even Mrs. Gable, who had never in her life passed up an opportunity to needle a servant she suspected of ideas above her station, found herself oddly quiet around the girl, as though she sensed something had shifted in the house that was beyond her understanding. Benedict, for his part, had retreated into the kind of cold formality he wore like armor whenever he did not wish to examine his own feelings too closely. He gave orders, he reviewed his ledgers, he rode out to inspect the tenant farms and returned in the evenings to dine alone in the vast, echoing dining room, staring at the empty chair across from him as though it might one day fill itself. The delivery came on the morning of the 3rd day. A footman arrived at the front entrance bearing an enormous arrangement of hothouse roses, deep red and impossibly full for the season, clearly grown under glass at considerable expense. Tucked among the blooms was a small ivory card, sealed with a drop of blue wax and addressed, in a confident, sloping hand, to Miss Cecily Hartwell. The footman, new to the household and unfamiliar with the tensions simmering beneath its surface, carried the bouquet straight through to the morning room rather than the servants' entrance, assuming any flowers so fine must be meant for the family. It was there that Benedict intercepted it, drawn by the unexpected scent of roses drifting into the corridor where he had been reviewing correspondence. He recognized the hand on the card before he had even broken the seal. He had seen it once before, on a shipping contract that had crossed his desk months ago, the same confident loops and flourishes belonging to Julian Ward. He should not have opened it. He knew that even as his thumb pressed beneath the wax, it was not his correspondence, not his flowers, not his business in any sense that could be defended before a magistrate or his own conscience. And yet he read it anyway, standing alone in the morning room, with the fire crackling low in the grate, his jaw tightening with every line. My dearest Cecily, I cannot stop thinking of our evening together, nor of the courage it took for you to meet me, despite the circumstances of your position. You deserve so much more than the life you have been given. Walk with me in the park on Thursday next, and let me show you what a different life might look like. One where no man commands your hours or your heart, but yourself. Yours in growing affection, Julian Benedict. Read it twice. Then, without allowing himself a third reading, he crossed to the hearth and dropped both the card and the roses into the fire. The blooms caught quickly, the delicate petals curling and blackening within moments, filling the room with an acrid, sweetish smoke entirely unlike their fresh perfume. The ivory card took longer, the wax seal melting and running before the flames finally consumed the paper itself, Julian's careful handwriting dissolving into ash, along with everything he had written. Benedict watched it burn with a grim satisfaction that lasted exactly as long as it took the fire to finish its work. Afterward, standing alone in the quiet morning room, with nothing but a faint smell of smoke to show for what he had done, the satisfaction curdled into something closer to disgust with himself. Cecily found the remains that same afternoon. She had come to lay a fresh fire in the morning room grate, as was her duty, and knelt to clear the old ashes before setting the new kindling. Among the gray remnants of the burnt-out logs, her fingers brushed against something that had not fully turned to char, a curled fragment of rose petal, still faintly red at its edge, and beside it, the corner of an ivory card with a smear of blue wax clinging to it. She sat back on her heels, staring at the fragments in her palm, and understood at once what had happened. She found Benedict in his study an hour later, not bothering to knock, the door swinging open hard enough to rattle against the wall. He looked up from his desk, and whatever he saw in her face made him set down his pen at once. "You burned it." Her voice shook, though whether from grief or fury he could not immediately tell. "You had no right. Whatever was written in that letter was mine to read, mine to answer or refuse, as I saw fit. You have no claim over my correspondence, any more than you have over my company. I have every claim while you live under my roof. That is not protection, Your Grace. That is tyranny." She threw the ashes she still clutched onto his desk, scattering gray flakes across his papers. "You speak of duty and propriety, but a duke does not creep about burning another man's letters like some jealous stable boy. You are not behaving as a nobleman ought. You are behaving as a man who cannot bear to lose something he never truly had a right to claim." The words landed harder than any blow could have. Benedict rose from his chair, and for a long moment the two of them simply stared at each other across the desk, the ashes of Julian's roses scattered between them like the wreckage of something neither of them could quite name. "Perhaps I am not behaving as a nobleman ought," he said at last, quietly. "But I would rather be a tyrant who keeps you safe than a gentleman who watches you walk into ruin." Cecily had no answer for that. She turned and left the study without another word, leaving Benedict alone with the ashes and the growing, uncomfortable certainty that his instincts about Julian Ward ran deeper than mere jealousy, though he could not yet have said why. The invitation to the opera arrived not for Cecily, but for Benedict, delivered by his aunt, Lady Ashworth, who had taken it upon herself to drag her nephew back into society after months of what she called his unbecoming sulking. She had secured a private box at the Royal Opera House for a performance of considerable fashion that season, and she would not hear of Benedict declining. "You have not been seen at a single function since March," she informed him over breakfast, 4 days after the incident with the roses, which she knew nothing about, but would certainly have had opinions on had she known. "People are beginning to talk. A duke your age, unmarried, hiding away at Blackwood like a hermit." "It does not do, Benedict. It does not do at all." He agreed to attend largely to silence her, and because some restless part of him welcomed any excuse to leave the manor, where every room seemed to hold some fresh reminder of the argument in his study. He did not think to bring Cecily. It did not occur to him, in fact, that Cecily's evening had any bearing on his own until he arrived at the opera house and saw, across the horseshoe of boxes, a face he recognized instantly. Julian Ward had secured a box directly opposite his own, and seated beside him, wrapped in a velvet mantle the deep green of a forest in shadow, was Cecily. Benedict went very still. She was transformed. Gone was the plain gray uniform and the white cap of a housemaid. In their place was a gown of soft blue silk that Benedict did not recognize and certainly had not purchased, her hair arranged in careful curls that caught the light of the chandeliers, the velvet mantle draped across her shoulders like something out of a portrait. She looked, for all the world, like a lady of quality, attending the opera on the arm of an admirer, which was, Benedict realized with a jolt of fury, precisely the impression Julian intended to create. It was a performance staged for the entire ton to witness. Half of fashionable London sat in those boxes tonight, and Julian had positioned himself and Cecily directly across from the Duke of Valerian's own box, ensuring that anyone who glanced Benedict's way during the performance would also see, just beyond him, the housemaid he had so publicly quarreled with, dressed like a duchess and laughing softly at something Julian had murmured in her ear. Lady Ashworth noticed nothing amiss, too absorbed in the opening aria to pay attention to her nephew's darkening expression. Benedict, however, could not have named a single note of the music that followed. His eyes kept returning to the opposite box, to the easy way Julian leaned toward Cecily, to the mantle that had surely cost more than a housemaid's yearly wages, to the small, private smile Cecily wore, that Benedict had never once managed to draw from her himself. By the interval, he could bear it no longer. He rose from his seat before the applause had finished, ignoring his aunt's startled protest, and made his way through the crowded corridors toward the grand foyer, where he knew Julian would eventually bring Cecily to take the air and be seen. He was right. He found them there within minutes. Julian bent close to say something that made Cecily laugh, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm. The sight of that hand undid the last of Benedict's restraint. "Miss Hartwell," his voice cut through the noise of the foyer, drawing glances from every direction. "A word, if you please." Julian turned first, his expression sliding smoothly from surprise into something closer to satisfaction, as though this confrontation was precisely what he had hoped for. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure. I did not realize you took such an interest in the comings and goings of your household staff." "This is not the place, Ward. On the contrary, I think it is exactly the place." Julian's voice carried, deliberately, to the small crowd of onlookers that had begun to gather nearby, drawn by the sight of a duke confronting a merchant over a woman in a borrowed gown. "Miss Hartwell is free to attend the opera with whomever she chooses, is she not? Or has that changed as well, along with the terms of her indenture? Something in the way he said it, the pointed emphasis on terms, the flicker of knowledge in his eyes, told Benedict that Cecily had confided in him about the altered contract. The betrayal of it stung more than he expected, though he had no right to expect her silence, no right to any of the fury now roaring through his chest. He stepped between them anyway, physically inserting himself into the small space that had existed between Julian and Cecily, close enough that Julian was forced to retreat a pace. "Miss Hartwell is leaving now. Your Grace," Cecily began, her cheeks flushed with mortification at the scene unfolding around them, dozens of eyes now openly watching. "Now, Miss Hartwell." He did not wait for her agreement. He signaled to his footman, who had trailed him from the box at a discreet distance, and within moments, Cecily found herself escorted firmly toward the entrance, Julian's protests trailing uselessly behind them, swallowed by the din of the crowd and the second bell calling patrons back to their seats. It was only once they were outside, in the cold night air, with the Duke's town coach waiting at the curb, that Benedict allowed himself to look properly at her, at the beautiful, borrowed gown, at the velvet mantle he now wanted to tear from her shoulders, at the anger and humiliation warring plainly across her face. He did not know, as he handed her roughly into the carriage and climbed in after her, that the mantle brushing against his bare hand carried something far more dangerous than the scandal of a public scene. He knew only that some instinct deeper than jealousy, some wordless warning he could not yet name, had told him he could not let her return to that opera box tonight. He would understand why before the carriage reached Mayfair. The carriage lurched forward into the darkness, wheels rattling over the cobblestones of Covent Garden as it turned toward Mayfair, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Cecily sat pressed against the far window, as far from Benedict as the confines of the coach allowed, her arms wrapped tightly around herself beneath the velvet mantle. The humiliation of the foyer still burned in her cheeks. She had been paraded past half of fashionable London, and though some small, buried part of her had felt an unwelcome flicker of relief at being pulled away from Julian's side, the greater part of her seethed with a fury she could barely contain. "You had no right," she said at last, her voice tight and low, "to speak to me that way, in front of all those people. You have made me a laughingstock. I have kept you from making a far greater fool of yourself. By humiliating me instead, is that your notion of protection?" Benedict said nothing. He sat across from her in the shadowed carriage, his jaw set, his hands clenched against his knees, as though he did not trust himself to keep them still. The anger that had carried him through the foyer had not faded, only turned inward, curdling into something closer to self-loathing at the sight of her stricken face in the lamplight outside the opera house. "Take it off," he said suddenly. Cecily blinked. "What?" "The mantle. Take it off." "I will not. It is bitter enough outside without you demanding I freeze on top of everything else. Cecily." He leaned forward, and something in his tone, no longer commanding, but urgent, almost frightened, made her go still. "Take it off. Now, please." It was the please that undid her resistance. In all the months she had served him, in all the arguments and confrontations of the past week, she could not recall Benedict ever once saying please to her, or to anyone. She reached up, fingers fumbling at the clasp beneath her chin, and had barely loosened it when Benedict crossed the small space of the carriage and seized her shoulders to help. His bare hands brushed against the lace trim at the mantle's edge, and he went rigid. There was a scent there, faint but unmistakable to anyone who had spent time studying botany, as he had in his university years, a bitter, slightly numbing sharpness that clung to the fine lace. He had smelled it once before, years ago. In a treatise on poisonous plants his tutor had insisted every gentleman of the land ought to know, if only to protect his own gardens and grazing fields from the wolfsbane that grew wild in certain shaded corners of the country. Aconite. His fingertips had already begun to tingle where they touched the fabric, a creeping numbness spreading across his skin that confirmed his worst suspicion beyond any doubt. "Do not touch the trim," he said, his voice suddenly sharp with a fear that had nothing to do with jealousy or wounded pride. "Cecily, listen to me. Do not touch the lace. You are frightening me." "Good. You ought to be frightened." He worked quickly now, careful to grip only the wool of the mantle itself and avoid the lace edging as he eased it from her shoulders, folding it inward so the trim faced away from both their skin. "This mantle has been treated with something. Aconite, unless I am very much mistaken. Wolfsbane, monkshood, whatever name you prefer for it. It grows in shaded, damp places, and every part of the plant is deadly if the sap touches broken skin or is absorbed through prolonged contact." Cecily stared at him, uncomprehending. "That is not possible. Julian gave me this mantle only tonight. Why would anyone—" She stopped. Her hands, which had been resting against the wool only moments before, began to tremble, and she looked down at her own fingers as though seeing them for the first time, searching for some sign of harm. "You have not been wearing it long," Benedict said, forcing his voice into something steadier than he felt. "An hour, perhaps less. It is likely the exposure has not been sufficient to do lasting damage, particularly through gloves. But I will not take that chance. We are going straight to my physician the moment we reach the house." "Julian would not." Her voice broke. "He could not have known. Someone else must have handled the mantle before it reached me. A tailor, a servant." But even as she said it, doubt crept into her own words, and Benedict watched her arrive, slowly and painfully, at the same terrible thought that had already taken root in his mind. Julian Ward had draped that mantle across her shoulders himself, in full view of the opera house, ensuring she wore it close against her skin for the better part of an evening. If the poison had been meant to reach anyone, it had been meant to reach her, or perhaps, through her, to reach someone who might later stand close enough to touch it. Someone who might, in a fit of jealous anger, seize her by the shoulders in the dark of a carriage. Someone very much like Benedict himself. He said none of this aloud, not yet, unwilling to voice a suspicion so monstrous without more certain proof. Instead, he gathered the folded mantle carefully in his lap, keeping the poisoned trim well away from either of them, and reached across the carriage to take Cecily's bare hand in his own gloved one, turning it gently to examine her skin in the dim lamplight for any sign of blistering or rash. She let him. Whatever anger had existed between them in the foyer seemed to have drained away entirely, replaced by a shared, wordless fear that drew them closer rather than apart. For the remainder of the journey to Mayfair, Benedict did not release her hand, and Cecily did not ask him to. By the time the carriage rolled to a stop before Blackwood Manor's grand entrance, both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever had passed between the Duke and the merchant these past weeks was no longer a matter of jealousy or wounded pride. Someone had tried, however clumsily, to bring death into that opera box tonight, and Cecily had very nearly carried it home on her own shoulders. Benedict did not wait until morning. The moment the carriage reached Blackwood Manor, he ordered a footman to ride at once for Dr. Aldous Finch, the physician who had attended the Valerian family for the better part of 2 decades and whose discretion Benedict trusted as much as his skill. Cecily was taken to the estate infirmary under the watchful eye of Mrs. Gable's own sister, a sturdy, sensible woman named Nell, who had once trained as a nurse and asked no questions she was not invited to ask. The mantle itself, folded carefully inside a linen sack and handled only by its wool, was locked in Benedict's private study to await the physician's examination. Dr. Finch arrived within the hour, roused from his bed and clearly displeased about it, until Benedict explained, in a low and urgent voice, precisely what he suspected. Displeasure gave way at once to grave attention. They worked by lamplight in Benedict's private laboratory, a small chamber off the study that had once belonged to his father, fitted with shelves of glass vials and a heavy oak work table scarred by decades of careful cutting and mixing. Dr. Finch examined the lace trim with a magnifying lens, touching only the very edges with a pair of long metal tweezers, his expression growing more troubled with every passing minute. "You were right to be cautious," he said finally, setting down the lens. "This has been treated, and treated deliberately. Someone has steeped this trim in a concentrated preparation of aconite root, likely dissolved in spirits, to allow it to soak into the fibers. It would need to sit against warm skin for some time to do its worst work, but given long enough exposure, a lady's throat and shoulders would absorb enough to bring on numbness, then paralysis of the heart and lungs. It is not a quick death, Your Grace. It is a slow, creeping one, easily mistaken by an ignorant household for a fainting spell or a sudden seizure of the nerves." Could it have been an accident? Some careless handling by a tailor, a dye that reacted poorly with the skin? No tailor's dye produces this scent, nor this precise pattern of concentration along the very edge most likely to touch bare skin. This was prepared with knowledge and with purpose. Finch fixed Benedict with a steady look. "Someone wished a lady wearing this garment considerable harm." Benedict said nothing for a long moment, staring at the innocuous strip of lace lying on the work table, hardly able to reconcile its delicate appearance with the violence it had been designed to carry. "Cecily wore this only a few hours," he said finally. "Would that be enough?" "Perhaps not enough to end outright, though I would not wager her life on it without a thorough examination. But consider this, Your Grace." Finch lowered his voice, though there was no one else in the room to overhear. "A garment such as this, given as a gift, would naturally find its way into close and repeated contact with its wearer over many evenings. Worn again and again, the exposure would compound, and who is it, in a young lady's life, most likely to draw her close, to take her by the shoulders or the hand, to spend long hours in her company?" Benedict felt the color drain from his own face as the physician's meaning settled over him. "A suitor," he said quietly, "or a husband, precisely. If Miss Hartwell had continued to wear this mantle at Mr. Ward's encouragement, and if Mr. Ward himself continued to court her closely, handling the garment, perhaps embracing her while she wore it, the exposure would not remain confined to her alone." The full shape of the plot unfolded before Benedict with sickening clarity. Julian had not sought to poison Cecily outright, not in any way that would draw immediate suspicion to himself. He had sought instead to use her as an unwitting vessel, a slow and untraceable means of delivering poison to whoever drew close enough to her to be affected by it in turn. A rival, a protector, perhaps even a future husband who might one day take her in his arms, not knowing what lingered in the very lace against her skin. Benedict himself, seizing her shoulders in the dark of the carriage tonight, had very nearly proven the plan's effectiveness. "Julian meant this for me," he said. the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He must have suspected I would not simply stand aside and watch her courted by another man. He gambled that jealousy alone would eventually put me close enough to be poisoned, without ever needing to raise a hand against me directly. A cowardly method, but an effective one, and difficult to trace back to its author, Finch agreed grimly. I would advise discretion, Your Grace, until you understand the whole of what you are dealing with. A man clever enough to devise such a scheme is unlikely to have acted entirely alone. Benedict thought at once of the shipping contract that had crossed his desk months ago, of Julian's sudden and unexplained rise from a merchant of modest means to a man capable of affording hothouse roses and velvet mantles and boxes at the Opera House. Wealth of that kind, acquired so swiftly, rarely arrived through honest trade alone. Danforth, he murmured. Dr. Finch raised an eyebrow. Lord Danforth. The name has not crossed polite conversation in some years, not since his disgrace and his flight to the continent. Ward's fortune appeared from nowhere within the past year. I had assumed some fortunate contract, a wealthy patron, nothing more. But if Danforth has returned, quietly, and found himself a willing instrument in a merchant with grievances of his own against the nobility that cast his patron out. Benedict did not finish the thought aloud. He did not need to. The pieces were arranging themselves into a shape far larger and more dangerous than a jealous rivalry over a housemaid's affections. He thanked Dr. Finch, swore him to silence regarding the night's discoveries, and sat alone in his study long after the physician had departed, staring at the poisoned lace locked away in its linen sack, understanding at last that the danger to Cecily, and to himself, had only just begun. A week passed before Cecily was permitted back to her regular duties, and even then, Benedict insisted she remain within sight of the house, her outdoor errands curtailed and her evenings confined to the estate grounds. She had not argued. The fright of that night in the carriage had settled something in her, a wariness she could not shake, even as the numbness in her fingertips faded, and Dr. Finch pronounced her free of any lasting harm. She had not been told everything. Benedict, still uncertain how deep the conspiracy against him ran, had kept the worst of his suspicions to himself, sharing only enough to explain why the mantle had been burned and why she must, for the present, avoid any further contact with Julian Ward. Cecily had accepted this with a quiet, wounded compliance that troubled Benedict more than her earlier defiance ever had. It was while dusting his private desk, a task she had performed 100 times before, without incident, that she found the papers. Benedict had been careless, or perhaps simply exhausted, after another long night spent poring over correspondence and old shipping records in search of some thread connecting Julian to Lord Danforth. He had left his desk unlocked, the drawer half open, papers scattered across the surface in the disordered manner of a man who had fallen asleep mid-thought and risen too abruptly the next morning to set things right. Cecily should have left the papers untouched. It was not her place to read her employer's private correspondence, and she knew it even as her eyes fell upon Dr. Finch's report, sitting open atop the pile, the physician's careful hand describing in clinical detail the properties of aconite and its presence on the velvet mantle's lace trim. She read it twice before her hands began to shake. Beneath the report lay a second stack of papers, older and creased from handling, letters written in a hand she recognized at once from countless notes and invitations over the past months. Julian's hand. But these were not addressed to her. They were addressed to Lord Danforth, dated across the better part of a year, and as Cecily forced herself to read through them, the careful, affectionate young man she had believed Julian Ward to be crumbled away entirely, replaced by something far colder. The letters spoke of Danforth's disgrace and exile, of his bitter determination to see the Duke of Valerian ruined for his role in exposing the fraudulent land dealings that had cost Danforth his title and his fortune years before. They spoke of Julian's own resentments, carefully cultivated grievances against a nobility he believed had used and discarded men of trade like himself once their usefulness ended. And they spoke, in language that made Cecily's stomach turn, of a housemaid at Blackwood Manor, who might prove a useful means of drawing close to the Duke, close enough, in time, to do him lasting harm without ever raising a blade or a pistol against him. "She is a pretty, biddable creature," one letter read, dated some 6 weeks past, "and easily flattered by attention she has likely never received from a gentleman of standing. I do not think it will take much to win her confidence, and once won, she may prove more useful to our purpose than any weapon." Cecily set the letter down with trembling fingers, bile rising in her throat. She had believed, all these months, that Julian's affection for her was genuine, a past friendship rekindled into something warmer, a rare and welcome kindness from a man who treated her as an equal rather than a servant to be ordered about. She had defended him against Benedict's suspicions, had grown angry and wounded on his behalf, had very nearly ruined whatever fragile trust remained between herself and the Duke, for the sake of a man who had, all along, viewed her as nothing more than an instrument, a tool to be used and, presumably, discarded once her purpose was served. Worse still was the second realization creeping in behind the first, cold and sickening. Julian had not simply sought to use her indifferently. He had sought, quite deliberately, to make her the means of Benedict's death. The mantle had not been an accident of poor judgment or a gift given in innocent affection. It had been a weapon, and she had worn it willingly, laughing on Julian's arm in full view of London society, while carrying death against her own skin, unknowing. She thought of the carriage, of Benedict's hands closing around her shoulders in the darkness, of how close he had come that night to touching the poisoned lace directly, rather than the wool she had been wearing beneath it. Had he been a moment less careful, a moment slower to recognize the scent on his own skin, the story might have ended very differently. Not with a quarrel in a carriage, but with a Duke gone of some mysterious seizure of the nerves, and a grieving, unwitting maid left to wonder forever what had gone wrong. The resentment she had carried toward Benedict these past weeks, for the altered indenture, for the burned letter, for the humiliation at the opera house, seemed suddenly small and foolish beside the truth now laid bare before her. He had not acted from mere jealousy or possessiveness alone, not entirely. Some instinct in him, whether love or duty or simple watchfulness, had led him to protect her from a danger she had been too blind, too flattered, too eager for a stolen taste of freedom to see for herself. She gathered the letters and the physician's report with careful hands, arranging them precisely as she had found them, and sat for a long moment at the edge of Benedict's desk, overcome by a wave of remorse so sharp it left her breathless. Whatever anger she had nursed against him these past weeks dissolved entirely, replaced by something far more urgent and far more frightening. Julian Ward had tried to finish the Duke of Valerian, using her as his unwitting instrument, and he would surely try again. She had to warn Benedict. Not out of duty, not out of fear for her own position in his household, but because some quiet truth had settled over her while reading those letters, one she was not yet ready to name aloud even to herself, that the thought of any harm coming to Benedict frightened her far more than anything Julian Ward had ever offered her. Cecily found Benedict in the stables, preparing to ride out to inspect the eastern boundary of the estate, and the words tumbled from her before he had even noticed her approach. I read the letters, Dr. Finch's report, and the ones from Julian to Lord Danforth. I did not mean to pry, Your Grace, but they were open upon your desk, and once I had seen the first line, I could not stop myself from reading the rest. Benedict went still, the reins slack in his hand. How much did you read? Enough to know what he intended, enough to know I was never more to him than a means of reaching you. Her voice caught, but she pressed on. You must act quickly. If he suspects the mantle has been discovered, he may attempt something else, something less easily traced back to him. It took Benedict less than a day to confirm what he had already begun to suspect through his own inquiries. A quiet word to a contact at Lloyd's, a discreet review of shipping manifests bearing Julian's name, and the picture assembled itself with damning clarity. Julian Ward held no legitimate claim to the fortune he had displayed so ostentatiously these past months. His credentials as an established merchant, the very foundation of his standing among London's trading houses, had been forged. His supposed partnership with a respected shipping firm in Bristol, nothing more than fabricated correspondence and a stolen family name, all of it financed by Lord Danforth's remaining wealth, smuggled back into England under a false identity since his disgrace years before. Benedict resolved to expose him where the exposure would do the most damage, and where witnesses of sufficient standing would make any denial impossible. The Royal Exchange on a trading morning was a scene of controlled chaos, merchants and brokers moving briskly between the covered arcades, voices rising and falling over the business of shipping contracts and insurance bonds, the great courtyard beneath its towering clock, filled with the particular energy of men whose fortunes rose and fell on the strength of a single signature. Julian Ward stood near the center of it, deep in conversation with two gentlemen Benedict recognized as investors of considerable standing, no doubt attempting to secure fresh capital on the strength of his fraudulent reputation. Benedict crossed the courtyard with a deliberate, unhurried stride, a leather folio of documents tucked beneath his arm, and the crowd around him seemed to part instinctively at the sight of a duke moving with such evident purpose. Mr. Ward. His voice carried easily across the courtyard, drawing glances from every direction. A word. Julian turned, and for the briefest instant, something flickered across his composed features. Not quite alarm, but a swift and careful recalculation. He recovered quickly, offering a smile that did not reach his eyes. Your Grace, this is hardly the setting for a private matter. On the contrary, I think it is precisely the setting. Benedict opened the folio and withdrew the first of the documents, holding it aloft for the benefit of the gathering crowd, which had begun to swell with the particular hunger London society reserved for a public scandal. This is a letter of introduction, bearing the seal of Hartwell & Sons, Bristol, the shipping firm whose partnership you have claimed these past 8 months. I took the liberty of writing to the firm directly. They have no record of any Julian Ward, nor of any partnership agreement bearing this seal, which I am reliably informed was forged with a wax stamp purchased under a false name from a stationer in Cheapside. A murmur rippled through the assembled merchants. Julian's smile had vanished entirely now, replaced by a tight, calculating stillness. You are mistaken, Your Grace, or misinformed. I am neither. Benedict withdrew a second document, this one bearing Julian's own handwriting, copied faithfully from the letters Cecily had discovered. Nor am I mistaken about your correspondence with Lord Danforth, a man convicted of fraud against the Crown and presently living in exile on the continent, whose wealth appears to have financed your entire fabricated fortune. Letters in which the two of you discussed, at considerable length, a scheme to bring about my death, using a housemaid of my household as an unwitting instrument. The murmur became a roar. Merchants who had, only moments before, considered extending Julian credit against his supposed shipping interests, now stepped back from him, as though he carried some visible contagion. Two of the trading house officials who oversaw the conduct of business within the exchange moved forward, their expressions grim, clearly weighing whether the situation called for the constables. Julian's composure cracked at last. You cannot prove any of this. Letters can be forged as easily as credentials, Your Grace, and I suspect you understand that better than most, given how conveniently these documents have appeared. I do not need to prove the letters alone. I have witnesses to a poisoned garment, examined by my own physician and prepared to testify to its nature. I have shipping records that will not withstand a single honest inquiry, and I have your own hand, which any clerk in this exchange who has corresponded with you these past months will recognize at a glance. Benedict stepped closer, his voice dropping, though it carried no less weight for its quietness. You gambled that a duke's jealousy would make him careless enough to die by his own hand, so to speak, without ever suspecting the true author of his death. You underestimated how far I would go to protect what is mine. It was the word mine that seemed to unravel whatever remained of Julian's nerve. He turned, perhaps intending flight, but the crowd had closed in too tightly around him, merchants and clerks alike blocking every path to the courtyard's exits with the particular righteous fury of men who had nearly been made unwitting accomplices to fraud. The constables arrived within minutes, summoned by one of the trading officials, and the arrest that followed was swift and public, conducted before the very men whose respect and capital Julian had spent the better part of a year cultivating through lies. He was led away in irons through the covered arcades of the exchange, past the very brokers and investors who had, only that morning, considered him a rising man of business, his protests of innocence swallowed entirely by the crowd's contempt. Benedict watched him go, and felt, for the first time in weeks, something approaching peace settle over the tangled fear and fury that had gripped him since the night of the opera. Cecily's honor, and his own, had been reclaimed in full view of London, and the man who had sought to use her as a weapon against him would trouble neither of them again. Blackwood Manor had not seen its grand hall filled with the full household staff in living memory, not since the days when Benedict's father had still ruled the estate and marked the turning of each season with some small ceremony or another. When word went round that the Duke had summoned every servant, from the scullery boy to the head groundskeeper, to assemble in the hall at 3 o'clock that afternoon, the house buzzed with a nervous energy that even Mrs. Gable, for all her authority, could not quite contain. Cecily stood near the back of the assembled crowd, still unsure why she had been called along with everyone else, still carrying the weight of the past fortnight in the tightness of her shoulders and the shadows beneath her eyes. The trial of Julian Ward, brief as it had been given the weight of evidence against him, had concluded only 3 days prior, his fate sealed by his own forged letters and the sworn testimony of a duke whose word carried more weight in a courtroom than any denial Julian could offer. She had not attended the proceedings herself, unwilling to face him again, and Benedict had not asked it of her. Now she stood among the servants she had worked beside for 2 years, watching Benedict enter the hall, dressed with a formality she rarely saw outside of church on Sundays, his expression unreadable, a leather folder tucked beneath one arm. "I have called you here," he began, his voice carrying easily across the crowded hall, "because I owe this household an accounting, and one of you in particular, an apology that has been far too long delayed." A murmur rippled through the assembled staff. Mrs. Gable's eyes darted toward Cecily, and for the first time in weeks, something like understanding crossed the housekeeper's stern features. "Some of you will recall an evening some weeks ago when raised voices were heard from my study, late into the night. I will not pretend the rumors that followed were entirely unfounded. I confronted Miss Hartwell that night over a matter I had no proper right to interfere with, and in my anger I revealed to her that I had purchased her family's outstanding debt some months prior and altered the terms of her indenture, binding her to this household indefinitely without her consent or knowledge." The murmur grew louder. Cecily felt her face flush hot as every eye in the hall turned toward her, though she kept her own gaze fixed on Benedict, unwilling to look away. "I will not offer excuses for what I did, though I have had cause enough in the weeks since to understand my own motives more clearly than I did that night. What began as an act of possessiveness I mistook for protection nearly resulted in Miss Hartwell's death, and very nearly my own, at the hands of a man who exploited both my jealousy and her trust for his own treasonous purposes." He paused, and the hall fell entirely silent, every servant straining to hear what came next. "Whatever debt I believed I was owed by binding her to this house has been repaid many times over. In courage I had no right to ask of her, and loyalty I had done nothing to deserve." He withdrew a single document from the leather folder, and even from the back of the hall, Cecily recognized the paper at once. Her own indenture, the very contract that had bound her to Blackwood Manor since past. The terms altered 8 months prior, without her knowledge, into something closer to permanent servitude. Benedict crossed to the great fireplace at the hall's center, where a fire had been laid and lit in preparation for exactly this moment, and without another word, he held the document to the flames. The paper caught quickly, curling and blackening at its edges, the years of her bound service dissolving into ash and smoke before the eyes of the entire household. Cecily watched it burn with something she could not quite name: grief for the years already given, disbelief that it should end so simply, and beneath it all, a rising, unfamiliar lightness that felt almost like joy. "Miss Hartwell is free," Benedict said, turning back to face the assembled staff, "of any indenture, any debt, and any obligation to remain in this household one moment longer than she chooses. She will receive, in addition to her freedom, a pension sufficient to support her comfortably for the remainder of her life, and the clear deed to her family's land, restored to her name alone, free of any claim by this estate or any creditor who might once have held it against her." A stunned silence held the hall for a long moment before it broke into a low, uncertain murmur of astonishment, several of the younger maids exchanging wide-eyed glances, even Mrs. Gable's composure slipping into something like genuine shock. Benedict crossed the hall to where Cecily stood, the crowd parting instinctively to let him pass, and stopped before her with none of the commanding authority he had carried only moments before. Here, in front of the household that had witnessed every stage of their quarrel and reconciliation, he looked, for the first time since Cecily had known him, uncertain. "I cannot undo the harm I caused you," he said, quietly enough that only those nearest could hear. "I can only offer you what should have been yours from the beginning, the freedom to choose your own path, without my name or my debt standing in your way." Cecily looked at him for a long moment, the ashes of her old life still smoldering in the grate behind him, and found she could not summon the anger she had once carried so readily. "You might have simply released me from the indenture without gathering the whole household to witness it, Your Grace. A private word would have sufficed, perhaps, But you were shamed in this house once, in this very hall, by rumor and suspicion that were largely of my making. I thought it fitting that your freedom be witnessed just as publicly as your disgrace once was." He hesitated, then added, more quietly still, "And I confess, I wished every soul in this household to understand precisely what you are owed, and precisely how little I deserve your continued presence beneath this roof, should you choose to leave it." Cecily said nothing to that, not yet, though something in her chest had begun to loosen at his words, some old, guarded certainty finally beginning to give way to a possibility she had not allowed herself to consider until this very moment. Cecily had not left Blackwood Manor, though everyone in the household, herself included, had expected she might. The weeks following the burning of her indenture passed in a strange, unsettled quiet. She was no longer required to scrub tiles or turn down beds, no longer bound by any duty to rise before dawn or answer to Mrs. Gable's summons, and yet she found herself lingering all the same, uncertain what freedom was meant to feel like after a lifetime of service, uncertain, too, of what precisely remained unspoken between herself and the Duke since that afternoon in the great hall. Benedict had given her space, deliberately and with visible restraint. He inquired after her comfort each morning at breakfast, ensured her pension arrived promptly and her family's land deed was properly recorded, and beyond these small kindnesses, he made no claim on her time or her company, as though determined to prove, through patient absence, that her freedom was genuine rather than merely a different shape of obligation. It was Lady Ashworth who finally broke the standstill, arriving at Blackwood Manor a fortnight before Michaelmas with an invitation to that season's final grand ball, held at the Valerian family's own estate, some miles distant, and a very firm opinion about who ought to attend it. "You cannot mean to leave the poor girl sitting about the manor, with nothing to occupy her but her own thoughts," Lady Ashworth informed Benedict over tea, with Cecily present in the room, though clearly not meant to be addressed directly on the matter. "She has been granted her freedom, her land, her pension, and you have done precisely nothing with it beyond avoiding her at every meal. If you will not act, Benedict, I shall act for you," and act she did. Within days, a seamstress had been summoned to Blackwood Manor to take Cecily's measurements, and a length of silk damask, the deep gold of autumn leaves, arrived shortly after, with instructions for a gown fit for a lady of quality, rather than a former housemaid attending a ball out of charity. Cecily protested at first, uncertain of her place among the guests who would fill the Valerian ballroom, uncertain, too, whether she wished to test the fragile, unspoken thing that had grown between herself and Benedict since the fire in the great hall. But Lady Ashworth would not be dissuaded, and beneath her protests, Cecily found she wanted, quite desperately, to go. The night of the gala arrived with a crispness in the air that spoke of the season properly turning, the Valerian estate lit from end to end with candles and lanterns, carriages arriving in a steady procession up the long drive. Cecily stood at the edge of the ballroom in her gold silk gown, her hair arranged by a lady's maid Lady Ashworth had insisted upon lending her for the evening, and felt, for the first time in her life, entirely unlike a servant. She did not see Benedict at first, lost as he was among the crowd of guests offering their compliments on the season's finest gathering, but she felt the moment he found her across the room. Conversation around him seemed to falter as his attention shifted entirely away from whoever had been speaking, his eyes fixing on her with an intensity that drew the notice of several nearby guests, curious murmurs already beginning at the sight of the Duke so plainly transfixed. He crossed the ballroom to her with unhurried purpose, and the crowd parted for him as it always did, though tonight there was something different in the way he moved, none of the guarded formality he usually carried into gatherings of this kind. Miss Hartwell. He bowed properly, as though she were any lady of standing, rather than a woman who had, only weeks before, been scrubbing frost from his glasshouse floor. You look remarkable. I feel rather like an impostor, Your Grace, if I am honest. You are no such thing. He offered his arm, and though several guests nearby watched with open curiosity, he seemed entirely unconcerned by their attention. Would you do me the honor of the opening waltz? It was. Cecily understood immediately. No small gesture. The opening waltz of a gala such as this was traditionally reserved for the host's most honored guest, a public declaration of favor that every soul in the ballroom would note and discuss for weeks to come. To offer it to a woman who had, until recently, worn a housemaid's cap beneath this very roof was to announce, before the whole of fashionable society, precisely how far Benedict intended his regard for her to extend. She placed her hand in his without hesitation. The musicians struck up the opening bars as Benedict led her onto the floor, and for a moment the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, dozens of eyes following the Duke of Valerian as he swept a former housemaid into the first waltz of the season. Whispers followed, inevitable and immediate, but Cecily found she did not care in the way she once might have. Whatever scandal had once clung to her name at the Opera House, whatever rumors Julian Ward had tried to weave into her ruin, dissolved entirely in the face of Benedict's plain, public devotion. "They are all watching," she murmured, as he turned her smoothly through the steps. "Let them watch. I have spent weeks proving to this household and to London society both that my intentions toward you were never dishonorable, however poorly I expressed them at the start. Tonight, I intend to make certain no one in this room mistakes my meaning again. And what is your meaning, Your Grace?" Something in his expression softened, the careful formality he usually wore in public gatherings slipping away entirely as he looked down at her, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it over the music. "I believe you already know, but I find I would rather show you properly than tell you here, surrounded by half of London's gossips." His hand tightened briefly around hers. "Will you walk with me? Once this dance is finished, there is somewhere I wish to take you." Cecily felt her heart quicken, some old caution warring briefly with a hope she had not allowed herself to fully trust until this very moment. She nodded, and Benedict's answering smile, rare and unguarded, told her he had understood everything left unspoken between them, everything the dance itself had already begun to say. The waltz ended to polite applause, and Benedict did not linger among the guests, eager to compliment him on his choice of partner. He led Cecily instead through a side door of the ballroom, along a quiet corridor lit only by a scattering of candles, until the noise of the gala faded behind them and the cold night air met them at a set of glass doors leading out into the estate's own conservatory. Cecily recognized it at once, though she had never set foot in this particular glass house before. It was smaller than the one at Blackwood Manor, but built along the same lines, moonlight pouring silver through its curved panes onto rows of dormant plants and the pale stone paths winding between them. The similarity was not lost on her, and she suspected, from the careful way Benedict watched her reaction, that it had not been lost on him either. "You brought me here on purpose," she said quietly, stepping through the doors into the cool, glass-scented air. "I did." He closed the doors behind them, muffling the last traces of music and conversation from the ballroom beyond. "I could not stop thinking of you kneeling on frozen marble at Blackwood, shivering over that wretched pail of water, while I stood like a coward among the orange trees and did nothing to help you. I have thought of it often these past weeks. I wanted tonight, in a place so like the one where I failed you, to prove I am no longer that man." Cecily walked slowly along the stone path, trailing her fingers over the cold glass of the nearest pane, remembering the ache in her knees and the numbness in her fingers on that frost-bitten morning, remembering, too, the strange, unspoken guilt she had sensed in Benedict even then, though she had not understood its source until much later. "You were watching me that day," she said. "It was not a question. I was. I told myself I had come to inspect the panes for winter damage. It was a poor excuse, and I knew it even as I told myself the lie." He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the chill of the glass-house air. "I have told myself a great many poor excuses these past months, Cecily. That my anger was concern, that my jealousy was duty, that binding you to my household against your will was somehow an act of protection rather than possession. I was wrong about nearly all of it, and it very nearly cost you your life before I understood how wrong I had been. You did understand. In the end, that is what mattered most." She turned to face him fully, the moonlight catching the gold of her gown, transforming her, for a moment, into something Benedict thought looked less like a duchess and more like the person she had always been beneath the borrowed silk and the housemaid's apron both. "You risked your own standing, your own reputation, to see justice done for what Julian tried to do to us both. You burned my indenture before the whole household rather than release me quietly, because you wished me to be seen and believed. Whatever mistakes came before, Benedict, I do not think a lesser man would have made amends so completely or so publicly." It was the first time she had used his given name without the weight of his title attached to it, and Benedict felt the word land somewhere deep in his chest, warmer than any formal address had ever managed. "I am no longer your master," he said. "I have no claim over you, no contract binding your hours or your obedience, no debt to hold over your family. Whatever I ask of you now, I ask as a man with nothing to offer but himself." He sank to one knee on the cold stone path, and Cecily's breath caught, her hand rising instinctively to her chest, as though to steady the sudden, unsteady rhythm beneath it. From within his coat, Benedict withdrew a small ring, the gold band set with a single dark sapphire, unmistakably old, unmistakably a piece of the Valerian family's own history, rather than some hastily purchased trinket. "This was my mother's signet before it became mine to bestow. I do not offer it lightly, nor do I imagine for a moment that I deserve your answer to be yes, given everything I have put you through since the night you returned at 3 a.m. with another man's favor tied to your wrist." A faint, rueful smile touched his mouth at the memory, though his eyes remained steady on hers, entirely earnest. "But I love you, Cecily Hartwell, not as a duke fond of a pretty housemaid, and not as a man who cannot bear to lose what he believes belongs to him. I love you as I have never loved anything in my life, freely chosen rather than inherited, and I am asking you now, with no contract and no claim between us but this, whether you will consent to be my wife." Cecily looked down at him for a long moment, at the man who had once locked her into a lifetime of servitude out of jealousy and fear, who had burned a letter meant for her out of possessive anger, and who had, in the months since, unmade every one of those wrongs with a thoroughness and humility she had never expected from a man of his rank. She thought of the frost-bitten marble, of the ashes of her indenture curling in the great hall's fire, of his hands closing carefully around poisoned lace to shield her from harm without a moment's hesitation for his own safety. She was no longer bound by law or by debt, or by anything but her own heart, freely given. "Yes," she said, and the word came without hesitation, without doubt, carrying none of the careful deference she had once been required to show him, and all of the honesty she had only recently learned she was permitted to speak aloud. "Yes, Benedict, I will." He rose and slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he drew her close beneath the moonlit glass of the conservatory, in the very kind of place where she had once knelt as his servant and now stood as his equal, Cecily understood that whatever journey had brought her from an indentured housemaid scrubbing frozen tiles to the woman standing here in gold silk and her own free will, it had ended exactly where it was always meant to, in the arms of a man who had finally learned to love her without needing to possess her at all.